The sun hung low over the Saturday flea market, casting long shadows over tables cluttered with forgotten treasures. The air buzzed with the hum of bargaining voices, the scent of old books, and the occasional glint of a hopeful find. Among the eager treasure hunters was Daniel Crowley, a man with a habit of finding value in the discarded and overlooked. A former school teacher turned part-time antiques enthusiast, Daniel wasn't looking for anything in particular, just the thrill of discovery. He weaved through the crowd, pausing at a vendor selling a chaotic assortment of paintings, their frames chipped, their canvases faded, nothing remarkable. And yet something caught his eye. Leaning against a wooden crate was a framed painting of a pastoral landscape, its colors muted by age. The painting itself was nothing special, just a generic countryside scene, the kind that might have once hung in a grandmother's parlor. But the frame intrigued him. It was old, ornate, and despite its wear, had an elegance that hinted at a history worth uncovering. He lifted it from the pile, running his fingers over the delicate woodwork. A tiny tear in the canvas caught his attention, barely visible beneath the glass. "How much?" Daniel asked, glancing at the vendor. $4. The man shrugged. $4. For a frame that alone was worth more than that? A bargain. Daniel reached into his pocket, pulled out some crumpled bills, and handed them over. The vendor barely looked up as he shoved the money into his apron. With his prize tucked under his arm, Daniel continued through the market, feeling that familiar twinge of curiosity, the one that always told him there was more to a find than met the eye. He had no idea just how right he was. Daniel placed the frame painting on his kitchen table, the dim glow of his desk lamp casting sharp shadows on its surface. He wasn't interested in the artwork itself, just the frame. He had always been fascinated by the way history hid in plain sight, tucked away in old objects waiting to be rediscovered. With careful hands, he examined the woodwork again, running his fingers along its edges. The craftsmanship was intricate but worn, suggesting it had once belonged to something far more valuable than the faded painting it now held. Then his eyes landed on the tiny tear in the canvas. A small, almost imperceptible bulge pressed outward from behind the painting, like something wedged between the canvas and the backing. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Was it just a buildup of dust and debris? Or was there something inside? Grabbing a screwdriver, he gently pried open the rusted clasps holding the painting in place. The glass cover lifted with a faint creak, and the canvas, brittle and aged, came free. He set it aside and turned his attention to the backing, an old crumbling piece of brown paper, yellowed at the edges, loosely hanging onto the wooden frame. As he peeled it back, a folded piece of parchment slipped onto the table. His breath caught. The texture of the paper was strange, thicker than normal, its surface rough with age. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, unfolding it carefully. Then the words leaped off the page. In Congress, July 4th, 1776. Daniel's mind raced. He blinked, trying to process what he was looking at. The elegant flowing script, the carefully inked names, the unmistakable title at the top, the Declaration of Independence. His pulse thundered in his ears. This couldn't be real, could it? His eyes darted across the parchment, the weight of its presence sinking in. He had just bought a $4 painting at a flea market, and tucked behind it was what appeared to be one of the most important documents in American history. But was it truly what he thought it was? And if it was, what was it doing? Daniel's hands trembled as he carefully spread the aged parchment across the table. His mind raced with impossible questions. How could this be real? Could it actually be one of the original copies of the Declaration of Independence? Or was it just a replica, some old reprint that had somehow ended up hidden behind a worthless painting? His heart pounded in his chest. He needed answers. Grabbing his phone, he quickly snapped a few pictures and ran a search. Within seconds, his screen was filled with images of the Dunlap broadsides, the first printed copies of the Declaration of Independence, created on the night of July 4th, 1776. The style, the format, even the tiny imperfections in the ink, everything about the document in front of him seemed to match. A shiver ran down his spine. Only 26 known copies still existed. Could this be number 27? He turned the parchment over, searching for any kind of markings. The edges were slightly frayed, but there were no signs of modern printing. The ink had seeped into the fibers of the paper, not just sat on top like modern prints. The texture of the paper itself felt old. Daniel swallowed hard. What do I do now? 1,000 thoughts flooded his mind. Should he call a museum? A historian? What if this was worth something? What if it was worth a lot? His fingers hovered over his phone. He hesitated. If this was real, it wasn't just valuable. It was priceless. And if people found out he had it, what then? Would someone try to take it? Would he get wrapped up in legal battles? Could he even sell something like this? He pushed his chair back, standing up, pacing. His small apartment suddenly felt too small, like the walls were closing in. He needed an expert, someone who could verify what he had found, but he also needed to be careful. There was too much at stake. Then another thought hit him. How did this end up hidden behind a cheap painting at a flea market? Was it lost, stolen, forgotten, or had someone put it there on purpose? Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This was bigger than he ever imagined, and he had a feeling his life was about to change forever. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the yellowed parchment burned into his thoughts. The idea that he might be holding an authentic, historical treasure was thrilling, but terrifying. By morning, he had made up his mind. He needed an expert. After hours of researching, he found a respected appraiser specializing in rare documents. Dr. Evelyn Carter, a historian known for verifying historical texts for museums and private collectors. Her reputation was solid, and most importantly, she valued discretion. He dialed her number, his hands clammy. A crisp, professional voice answered. Dr. Carter speaking. Daniel hesitated, then took a deep breath. I have something I think you need to see. Within hours, he was standing outside a small private appraisal office in downtown Philadelphia, the document carefully tucked into a folder inside his messenger bag. The weight of it felt heavier than it should. The door chimed as he stepped inside. Dr. Carter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, with an air of no-nonsense expertise, greeted him with a single raised eyebrow. You said you found a document of interest? She asked, motioning for him to sit. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He reached into his bag, pulled out the parchment, and placed it gently on the table. I think this might be an original copy of the Declaration of Independence. Dr. Carter's expression remained neutral until her fingers brushed against the paper. Her eyes narrowed. She leaned in, lifting the parchment under a magnifying glass, her brow furrowing. She didn't speak. Instead, She grabbed a UV light, scanning the fibers. A moment later, she reached for a reference book and flipped rapidly through the pages. The silence stretched too long. Finally, she looked up. "Where exactly did you find this?" Her voice was careful, measured. Daniel swallowed hard. "Behind a painting at a flea market." Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. She sat back, her gaze now fixed on him, calculating, intense. "Mr. Crowley," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "if this is what I think it is, you may have just stumbled upon one of the most valuable discoveries in modern history." Daniel's stomach dropped. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too heavy with the weight of her words. "Is it real?" he forced himself to ask. Dr. Carter hesitated, then gave the smallest of nods. "There's still more testing to do," she said, her voice edged with excitement. "But from what I'm seeing, this could be an authentic Dunlap broadside." Daniel gripped the arms of his chair. A real Declaration of Independence, one of the first ever printed, and he had just bought it for $4. But before the shock could fully settle in, Dr. Carter's expression shifted, a flicker of something uncertain. "There's something else," she murmured, "something unusual." Daniel's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Dr. Carter tapped the parchment. "This wasn't just lost or forgotten," she said. "Someone hid this on purpose." Silence, a chill, crawled down Daniel's spine, and for the first time he wondered, had he just found something someone didn't want to be found? Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. "Someone hid it," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter didn't look up from the parchment. Her fingers traced the edges carefully, her sharp eyes scanning every fiber of the aged document. "Yes," she said, "and not recently." She leaned in, running her hand along the back of the parchment. "Look at this." Daniel squinted. At first, it seemed like nothing, just the rough, worn texture of ancient paper. But then, under the glow of her desk lamp, he saw it. A faint watermark, a tiny emblem, pressed into the fibers of the parchment, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it. "What is that?" Daniel asked, his throat dry. Dr. Carter exhaled sharply. "I've seen this mark before. It belonged to a secret printing press, one that operated outside of official government orders. Some historians believe certain early copies of the Declaration were printed in secret by revolutionaries who feared British spies were watching the official printers." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Are you saying this could be even rarer than a Dunlap broadside?" he asked. Dr. Carter's expression was unreadable. "If this was an unauthorized, secret print, then yes, this would be an even bigger discovery." Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. Then a new thought crept into Daniel's mind. If this was printed in secret, why was it hidden inside a cheap painting? Who put it there? Dr. Carter gave a slow nod, as if she'd been asking herself the same thing. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know one thing. This didn't end up in that flea market by accident." Daniel's breath hitched. Dr. Carter pushed back from the table, standing. "There's a way to find out more. There are forensic tests we can run, ink composition, fiber dating, printing anomalies. It will take time, but it will tell us exactly when and how this was made." Daniel's mind spun. The document, the mystery, the history behind it. His life had changed overnight. And then another thought hit him. "What if someone wants it back?" he murmured. Dr. Carter's expression darkened. "If this was hidden on purpose," she said carefully, "there's always a chance someone is still looking for it." Daniel's skin prickled. For the first time, fear settled in. Had he just uncovered something he was never meant to find? Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He quickened his pace, resisting the urge to break into a full sprint. He told himself he was being paranoid, that the man across the street was just a stranger, nothing more. But something inside him screamed otherwise. He reached his apartment building and hesitated at the entrance. Should he go inside? If someone was watching him, if someone knew what he had, was it safe to go home? His fingers tightened around his messenger bag, the priceless document inside suddenly feeling like a curse rather than a miracle. A taxi rolled by, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. In the glass reflection of the lobby doors, he saw the man in the coat round the corner. No, this wasn't a coincidence. Daniel acted on instinct. Instead of going inside, he veered left, stepping quickly into a crowded coffee shop next to his building. He slipped inside and took a seat by the window, placing his bag on his lap. As he stole another glance outside, the man had stopped. He stood across the street, his expression unreadable, eyes still locked on Daniel's last position. Daniel's mouth went dry. He wasn't safe. His mind raced. Who was this man? A historian? A collector? Or something worse? Was this about money? Or did someone know exactly what he had uncovered? The possibility twisted in his gut. Dr. Carter's words echoed in his mind. This didn't end up in that flea market by accident. Maybe the document had been hidden because it was too important to destroy. Maybe someone had risked everything to keep it out of the wrong hands. And now, those hands were looking for it. Daniel's fingers hovered over his phone. Should he call Dr. Carter, the police, a lawyer, or should he disappear? He took a deep breath. No. If history had tried to bury this document, then he would be the one to bring it back into the light. A resolve settled in his chest. He wasn't going to let fear decide his next move. He grabbed his bag, stood up, and walked out the back door. As he disappeared into the city, one thought burned in his mind. Some secrets aren't meant to stay hidden. The end.